for the next few seminars and so on. I'm Sukrita, and it's a great pleasure sharing this session. I look forward to Ritu's talk, but before that, let me just, I'm told that I need to make this announcement before we get into the subject itself. On the 11th March at 3 p.m. on Monday, there is another public lecture by Dr. Deepti Priya Mehrotra, and this would be Reinventing Nonviolence Ideas and Ethics. And then on the 12th of March, which is a weekly seminar, there would be Professor A.R. Vasavi, Senior Fellow here, who is going to be speaking on 4 emblematic figures and the making of a new India 1997-2012. And then again on the 13th, there will be a public lecture by Professor J. Srinivasan, which is going to be on how should India deal with climate change. And then on the 14th again, quite a few. So on the 14th then there is a seminar which should be led by Dr. Elias Hussain, and he will be speaking on Jawaharlal Nehru and the language policy of the Republican India. So that's it for the moment. And then I noticed that there's something else on the 14th March as well. So So this would be a panel discussion, and this would be, the panelists would be Vrinda Grover, Uma Chakrabarti, and Rosemary Zuwitsu. That's how you pronounce it. And this would be on gendered violence and the search for justice. And then one just goes on and on, 15th, 16th, and 18th, and 19th, and then 19th. But for the moment, I guess this is enough. It's a great pleasure to be here to be not really introducing a very well introduced, and you're all familiar with the work of Ritu Menon. Ritu Menon is a known publisher, but a scholar publisher. A scholar publisher, a writer publisher who we all know co-founded Kali for Women, and now, which is of course India's first and the oldest feminist press, internationally renowned. She has written extensively on women, religion, women in violence, women in situations of armed conflict, and I remember how I was bowled over when I read her Borders and Boundaries, and all the work that I was doing in literature on partition and women. I had to rethink my thesis after having read Borders and Boundaries. Thank you for doing that work, a literally groundbreaking study in partition historiography. She has also co-authored Unequal Citizens, a study of Muslim women in India, and Educating Muslim Girls, a comparison of 5 Indian cities. This was published in 2005, and then she's also co-edited in A Minority, Essays on Muslim Women in India. And another book that I very recently saw, and I was very intrigued by that, which of course was published back in 2004. This was not No Man's Land, but No Woman's Land, women from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh who write on the partition of India. So a lot of great work, good work, path-breaking work, also in the context of gender-based censorship, for which she has conducted worldwide workshops, conferences, colloquia with about 300 women writers, and writing in more than 10 languages. We expect now a talk on somebody who, thank you Ritu for choosing this subject, because I think Nayantara, the great writer who I think should be put into the domain of categorized as doing history and political history of that, through fiction in a very, very significant way. And I really don't appreciate the idea that we guys, I would say, sitting in English departments all over the country, haven't really given adequate attention to somebody like her. And so we mouth words like interdisciplinarity and, looking at how history connects with with fiction, but when somebody of the significance of Nayantara Sahgal has been around and writing in a very prolific fashion. And interestingly, she has, even in her fictions, there are traces of autobiography. And that is such a close witness to history, who is fictionalizing history and also taking history straight on, contemporary history. And I'm glad that Ritu is taking that on as a subject. She's looking at autobiography. I'm very interested in knowing how she will deal with this subject in the context of the messing boundaries between fiction and autobiography. Where do we draw the line? And how do we relate to, and how at a very young age she then wrote two autobiographies. Age 27, I think, was the first one, and then she writes another one later, the third one. The compulsive need to write an autobiography, which can't be dismissed only as memoirs, It's not that kind of subject. There is a construction of a subjectivity also, but more on that from me maybe a little later. And we have Ritu here to tell us more about this, the question of unraveling the personal and the political autobiographies of Nayantara Sahgal. Thank you very much, Sukrita, and thank you for a very nice introduction, a very, very charming and a very thoughtful one. And thank you very much, Professor Rangarajan, for asking me to speak here. And happy Women's Day, everybody. It is, after all, March 8th. Lots of things happening outside the city, and I'm happy that there's something happening at Teen Murti as well on this day. How much time do you have? About an hour? An hour to speak, and then what I'm going to talk about is based on a biography that I'm writing on Nayantara Sahgal, and it is an attempt to write a feminist biography, and what a feminist biography would look like if one were to very self-consciously speak about the personal and the political. And political in both senses of the term, which is to say political as is generally understood, and political as feminism has theorized it, which is to say the personal is political and political is personal, which I don't need to repeat. But it's also an intersecting of the personal, the political, the literary, and the historical. Now, it's a difficult one. It's a pretty complicated kind of unraveling that I'm trying to do. And today's talk is really only about the very beginning, the two autobiographies. Of course, when you move into the later work, this tangled skein unravels in very much more interesting and complicated ways, and also you begin to see the connections much more strongly. But anyway, as an attempt to begin this exercise, I will read and also perhaps speak a little bit, and of course be very happy to take questions. I'm about halfway through the biography. What I'm writing right now is probably what would interest most people, but I'm not going to speak about it today, which is the break between Nayantara and Mrs. Gandhi, of course, and everything that happened as a result in Nayantara's writing. So it becomes, as I said, a very interesting conjunction. So simply to keep in mind that there is here today just a discussion on the autobiographies, but as Sukrita has mentioned and has become much clearer as we go along, the connection between what is autobiographical in her autobiographies, of course, what is autobiographical in her fiction, and what becomes very personal political in all her political writing, is what makes her an extremely interesting and fascinating subject. This particular talk I have entitled Sentimento, The Self Beneath the Surface. I'll begin with Virginia Woolf's assertion that very few women yet have written truthful autobiographies, meaning thereby that concealment with them is reflexive. And yet it is a fact that in India at least many women first came to writing through autobiography. In a crucial sense, writing her autobiography was a woman's way of narrating her own story, of recognizing the importance of doing so, of knowing deep down in a fundamental way that to be storyless was, as Heilbrunn has informed us, her ultimate anonymity. Some of the earliest autobiographies in Bengal, at any rate, date from the mid-19th century onwards and were written without fanfare or artifice. Sincere attempts at recording lives and times when both mobility and education for women were hard to come by. Often moving and poignant, they are also valuable as unself-conscious social history, offering a glimpse into cultural mores, codes of behavior, and gender relations. Yet the genre itself is complicated, fraught with contradictory pressures. It hovers between reportage, retrospection, and revision. It slips between truth and memory, between revelation and concealment. It comes to us loaded with affect, raises questions of veracity and the fictive, of primacy, of partiality, of mediation. It is moreover not simply a narrative, but an act of narrativization, a twofold transformation of lived life, the figuration into memory of experiences and sensations, and then the transmutation of that memory into a coherent narrative. Perhaps even via the autobiographical act, an attempt to reinvent a life and thus possess it more fully. A feminist reading of autobiographies must needs attend to yet another factor, the split between the personal and political selves, the separation of private and public, and often between private and secret. How then and where then should I situate myself when attempting to write about two autobiographical texts by the well-known novelist Nayantara Sahgal, whose own biography I am researching? How am I to reconcile not only all of the contradictions and complications inherent in reading such texts, but accommodate what I know of her life from other sources, including letters, interviews, and conversations with her, information and material that the general reader is unlikely to have, with what she herself has chosen to represent, reconstruct, recall, and retell. I can't pretend that I have in any way resolved this predicament or arrived at a clear understanding of my relationship both to the author or to her autobiographies, but let me attempt a tentative narration of the unfolding as it occurs. Nayantara Sahgal belongs to one of India's most distinguished political families and is also one of the most eminent Indian writers in English today. She has been a journalist, a political commentator, essayist, biographer, and novelist, and perhaps the only woman writer in English to have consistently reflected the political life of India in her novels. Post-independence, that is to say. From her first novel, A Time to Be Happy, published in 1958, to her latest, Lesser Breeds, published in 2003, she has followed the evolution of democracy and politics in the country, from its promise of equality and freedom from want to its present crisis of credibility. In all, she has written 9 novels, among them the well-known Storm in Chandigarh, The Day in Shadow, Situation in Delhi, Rich Like Us, etc., etc. But it is her first book, Prison and Chocolate Cake, published in 1954 when she was 27 years old, that brought her early fame and it is her two autobiographical works, Prison as well as the sequel to it, From Fear Set Free, that I will be speaking about. All the quotations that I read out are from personal interviews with her and from her letters. You see, she said to me, politics or political events have formed the background of my novels, and politics is essentially about power. But power is also the equation between men and women, or between men and men. It's the equation in all situations, whether domestic or political. The two things are interlinked, of course, and politics is as much a part of our domestic environment and family environment as it is of the country and gender relations. I've always said politics is my only material, seen it as a sort of tragic involvement, tragic intermeshing. One is so yoked to it. Growing up in Allahabad in the 1930s and 40s as the daughter of Vijayalakshmi and Ranjit Sitaram Pandit and niece of Nehru, politics was Sahgal's daily diet, and prison her parents' second home. My family plunged into civil disobedience, she says. Here it was that national and family history met. The connection became rooted, emotional, permanent. Normal, quote-unquote, family life for Nayantara was an extended experience of separation and personal sacrifice in pursuit of independence and freedom from colonial rule. Arbitrary arrests, unjust fines, unprovoked violence, and the response to them by her family made for an early exposure to and lasting impact of two fundamental tenets of Indian resistance: non-violence and satyagraha. Nehru, whom she calls her third parent, and Gandhi's political ideology remained the barometer by which Sahgal gauged the practice of Indian democracy post-independence. Their idealism and integrity to political principle became the lodestar that guided her own commitment to India and to the political developments of the day. Her novels of the 1970s and 80s, as well as her political columns, reflect her anxiety at the abandonment of a particular Nehruvian political and social project for India, and at the consequent debasement of its political culture. Prison and Chocolate Cake, Nayantara's first book, was written in the winter of 1952-53, when the author was 25 years old and the mother of two children. Married at 21 to Gautam Sahgal, the son of a prominent Punjabi family of professionals, the couple lived in Bombay, where Gautam was employed with the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sahgal. Sara Pandit, as she had been known, could hardly have chosen a partner whose background and temperament was so completely at variance with her own. But their attraction to each other had been immediate and electric, her words. And they made an extremely striking couple. Introduced to each other by Tara's aunt, Gauri Nehru, married to Nehru's cousin B.K. Nehru, who stayed with the Sahgals when she first came to India from Hungary. They met at the Delhi Gymkhana Club in December 1947, very soon after Tara's return from the US. Although Gautam belonged to a well-known West Punjab family and the Sahgals had considerable property in East Punjab as well as Lahore, the news of Tara's engagement to him was greeted with some concern. Letters flew between Mrs. Pandit and her brother, between her and Gauri Nehru, and between her and her brother-in-law in Bombay. The haste with which Tara announced her intention to marry Gautam a mere 2 months after meeting him prompted even her beloved Mamu into caution her. Nehru's misgivings about his young niece's whirlwind romance were expressed in characteristically mild tones. He thought she should do something with her education, work perhaps. There were so many ways in which she could make herself useful, and there was time enough for marriage. She was only 20 after all, and her education was just beginning. At the very least, he said, she should take some time off to think it over. Tara herself was acutely aware of the mismatch. She said, "The partition became for me more than a troubling event. Because of it, I had met a young man employed in a British firm, an Indian whose India had been as different from mine as any man I could have met, whose home in Lahore had had the best of linen, glass and wine that his father's frequent trips to Europe could provide, in contrast to mine, which in support of the Swadeshi movement used only Indian made goods. What was more, this was an Indian to whom Gandhi was just a name, and freedom for his country, an event that had deprived him of his home and a part of his inheritance. I worried about the differences between us, and soon learned that hesitation was not a part of Gautam's makeup. He tackled problems with a figurative lawnmower. After a while, they no longer existed. Everything eventually became a smooth lawn. For me, life resembled a rock garden full of unaccountable small crevices and obstructions. How could I enter his world or he mine? We would make a new one, said Gautam. He envisaged no problems. He concentrated on the particular, and the particular issue soon became marriage. Gregarious and ambitious, Gautam Sahgal rose rapidly up the corporate ladder in Bombay, and the family enjoyed all the comforts and privileges of his success. Bombay's social life glittered with the city's corporate smart set and its old business elite, a circle in which Gautam felt completely at ease and at home. Unlike his first employer, Bird and Company, Sivagadi was swift and non-colonial, eager to enter the huge market for pharmaceuticals that India promised. The Sahgals entertained with gusto, and along with Gautam's business contacts, assorted diplomats and her mother's acquaintances, Nayantara frequently met all the social contacts and literary and others whom a young woman could. Jay Tata and his wife, the painter Jahangir Sabawala, Ramesh and Raj Thakur, Frank Moraes, Peter Jayasinghe, R.K. Lakshman, etc. But despite this an extremely full and busy social and family life, she never really took to the city. She found its intellectual community tiresome, not real in any sense, with no real values. The change for her was dramatic. She said, Bombay was very cosmopolitan and westernized, a complete change from Allahabad. I had never been there except to see Mati, her aunt Krishnadi Singh, during vacations. It was my first experience of what people call normal life, for which I had no preparation. I had no idea that people could go to the office from 9 to 5, come back, go to the club. The routine, the whole ambiance, was foreign to me. An unfamiliar domesticity together with the unaccustomed idleness of the upper middle classes now encircles Nayantara. The urge to do something beyond the domestic, to partake actively in some way in the life of the country, made itself felt in her life as early as 2 years after her marriage. In 1951, she was married in 1949, in 1951, she wrote to her uncle Nehru, confiding in him her frustrations as being just wife and mother, as well as her difficulties in her marriage, seeking his advice. Should she join the Congress, engage in social work, or given her circumstances, just right? Nehru replied immediately and sympathetically, encouraging her to do something worthwhile outside the home. One cannot ignore the domestic sphere, he said, but a wider activity gives more meaning to life. He refrained from telling her what to do, however, remarking only that there were several ways of doing something socially useful. Should she decide to write, her writing should have some purpose. In the final analysis, he wrote, one writes from one's experience of life. The richer the experience, the better the writing. But biology intervened. Nayantara's second child, her son Ranjit, was born 9 months after she wrote to Nehru, and it was only a full year later that she had the time and leisure to pick up her pen. Prison and Chocolate Cake became that work written from experience. Her attempt at capturing, quote, the special magic of growing up during India's struggle for freedom as part of a family whose men and women had committed their lives to it. I knew history would record the struggles, she had said, but her purpose was altogether different. She wanted to present, quote, the texture of a time, the froth and bubble of a mood or a moment, the everyday reality of that struggle and what it meant as she experienced it, to offer a real side view of history in the making. There may not be too many opening sentences in a memoir or autobiography as immediately arresting as the following. This is the opening line of Prison and Chocolate Cake. Some things will always remain a mystery to me. How did Mummy and Papu have the courage to send us to America in 1943? Few went as we did at our age, from a peaceful country on a troop ship at the height of World War II. We were Nayantara, then 16, and her older sister Chandalekha, 19, headed for the US and Wellesley College in Massachusetts on an ocean journey that would take several weeks. The year was 1943. India was part of Britain's war effort, while at the same time resisting British imperialism and demanding that they quit India. It would have taken an extraordinary set of circumstances for any parents to dispatch two teenage girls, unchaperoned, to a country several demanding that they quit India. It would have taken an extraordinary set of circumstances for any parents to dispatch two teenage girls, unchaperoned, to a country several thousand miles away while a war was in progress. And the circumstances were indeed extraordinary. On August 8, 1942, the All India Congress Committee passed its Quit India resolution in Bombay, and on August 9, Gandhi, Azad, Patel, Nehru, Sarojini Naidu, and other members of the Congress Working Committee were arrested and taken by a special train to Pune. The AICC office at Suraj Bhavan was sealed yet again by the police, and because it was only a matter of time before she, Indira, and Firoz Gandhi were also arrested, Vijayalakshmi Pandit set about organizing Azad Bhavan, where the family now lived, in preparation for her absence. This included disposing of pamphlets and incriminating documents before the police got hold of them, sending valuables to friends' homes for safekeeping, and finding refuge for two young friends, fugitives from the police. Lekha herself had been imprisoned for participating in the Quit India protest of 1942, and other family elders were liable to be picked up at any time. The political situation was likely to worsen very quickly, and so, at Madam Shah Kaishek's suggestion, Nayantara and Lekha were sent to Wellesley, and in 1945 their younger sister Rita to a school in Vermont. All this is recounted, sometimes humorously, at other times poignantly, in Prison and Chocolate Cake, interleaved with vignettes of family life at Unravelling, with experiences of changing schools again and again as the uncertainty of their parents' presence at home grew. And the sisters learned to come to terms with the fact that Vijayalakshmi and Ranjit Pandit were more likely to be in jail than out of it. When Chandalekha at one point wistfully wondered whether life would ever be normal for them, Nehru responded with, normal, favoring the word as though it was as foreign to his vocabulary as it was to his life. The fact is that we live in an upside-down world, darling, and there's no use expecting life to be easy. It's not a simple matter adjusting to such a world, especially for those who are sensitive. It's not normal for most of us to spend our lives in prison, cut off from our families. It certainly should not be normal for intelligent human beings to spend all their time and energy killing each other off, as they're doing all over the world. It isn't normal either for some people to starve, and others to get indigestion through overeating. All this is very abnormal and wrong, but it's happening. The bleakness of those days in a sprawling house stripped of valuables, even carpets and furniture, would be temporarily banished when Padmaja Naidu, beloved friend of the family, alighted like an exotic bird to keep the children company. Brilliantly plumed in glowing silks and flowers in her hair, Padmati as she was called, dispelled the gloom with warmth and wit. Delicious tidbits like the girls being laughed at when they wore khadi frocks and little Gandhi topis when out for a walk, or a nervous Indira Nehru offering potato crisps to Sir Stafford Crisp when he came to visit, are part of a happy record of times when all the adults were in residence. As a welcome counterpoint to that upside-down world is the excitement of New York, the pleasure of an uninterrupted 4 years in an invigorating environment at Wellesley, opening up of new intellectual vistas and hugely enjoyable locations on the east and west coasts of America or in Mexico, and in the homes of luminaries like Pearl Buck and her husband, the powerful black singer Paul Robeson, the Henry Luces, the photographer Dorothy Norman, and many, many others. Prison and Chocolate Cake was published in 1954 in New York. A network of friends and acquaintances in places that matter enabled the smooth passage of the manuscript from Nayantara's typewriter to her editor, Herbert Weinstock, at the publishing house of Alfred Knopf. I won't go into the details of that, but the book was well received, happily reviewed for a variety of reasons. The author was a young, well-connected writer writing about contemporary political situations in a country that had captured the world's imagination for its non-violent resistance to colonial rule. She presented an insider's view of India's freedom movement with all the freshness and idealism of a 25-year-old, and she wrote a limpid prose. Contrary to what might have been expected, hers was no picture of exotic India or of beleaguered womanhood, comforting to those who looked for conformity. Rather, a warm and human account of an unusual family that lived in and shaped its country's fortunes at a historic moment. It became a literary and commercial success, marking out a space for itself as a political memoir with a difference. From Fear Set Free, the second volume of Sahgal's autobiography was written in Bombay and published in 1962 by Norton in the US and by Victor Blank in the UK. Knopf, who had published Prison and Chocolate Cake, declined from Fear Set Free, saying it did not strike the right note for them, that they were not confident about its marketability, even though they had met with considerable success with Prison. Weinstock said to the author about Prison and Chocolate Cake, which had sold 7,000 copies then, "This is not a bestseller," he said, "but it is a very handsome sale in what has been a very poor publishing season." We can see that poor publishing seasons have been around for a while. However, the left-wing British publisher, Victor Blank, who had published Prison and Chocolate Cake, was more than happy to take from Fear Set Free, and not only because he was a great supporter of Indian independence. Beginning with her return to India from the US in 1947 and after her graduation from Wellesley, From Fear Set Free deals with the early years of Nayantara's marriage to Gautam Sahgal, the birth of her 3 children, and the first few years of her life in Bombay. Interspersed with anecdotal accounts of family reunions and amusing but sharply observant comments on Bombay are glimpses of how the country was making its transition to independent governance. The first post-independence elections were held in 1952, and Nehru undertook a nationwide tour to alert the electorate about the importance of voting, of exercising their franchise for the first time ever. Around the same time, Vinoba Bhave started out on the first leg of his Bhudan movement, spurred by his visit to Telangana in 1951 and his encounter with its desperately poor landless farmers. It was here that one man in the audience pledged 100 of his 200 acres to anyone in need. Vinoba's tour of Telangana that year netted 15,000 acres for the landless peasantry. Slowly, other states followed suit. All this is in the autobiography, which is why I'm mentioning it. The linguistic division of states in the 50s was another change, and she speaks about Andhra Pradesh, Bombay province, the division of Bombay into Gujarat and Maharashtra, etc., etc. In 1963, Nayantara Sahgal embarked on a book tour of the US, which consisted of 18 speaking engagements at various public and educational institutions across the country. And though she enjoyed it, she said she didn't dare to repeat it. Writing in her Chandigarh diary later that year, she remarked wryly, quote, lecture tour decidedly helpful in preparing one to face almost anything. Everybody ought to go on a lecture tour, which, if it doesn't drive one mad, has character building possibilities. Grateful my tour over and character built. The book itself received mixed reviews, some decidedly tepid. One, in fact, called it, quote, a glamorized version of a housewife's diary, an assessment with which Nayantara herself agreed. Writing many years later to her close friend, the civil servant Ian Mangasrai, she wrote, quote, from Fear Set Free has irritated me profoundly. The fact that I allowed it to be published at all without a struggle. Originally, it was very political, and the publisher cannot, then no one would be interested in that kind of book from me. They wanted something lighter, more readable. They are very fond of using words like heartwarming and charming, both of which make me a little ill. Anyway, the whole thing was rehashed in a lighter vein, and it became all about nothing in particular. Unquote. Left to herself, she said she would have dwelt on India's prickly relationship with the US of John Foster Dulles, would have introduced much more of the political context in the country, of the business and social environment they lived in. And the irony is that despite the rehashing at his request, Connaught declined its publications, and they ceased to be Nayantara's publisher after this experience. Although Nayantara has written that the process leading to freedom has so closely affected my family and my upbringing that it seemed to me an event almost of personal significance, unquote, the difference in tone and texture between prison and from Fear Set Free is marked. It marked as well a shift, albeit temporary, in her preoccupations. Prison was focused almost exclusively on the struggle for freedom, in which the intertwined histories of the nationalist movement and family involvement came together seamlessly in a narrative that was at once charming autobiography and incipient national biography. This was what made it unusual and interesting as a maiden venture. 8 years separated the publication of Prison and From Fear Set Free, during which time Nayantara wrote and published her first novel. She appeared to have settled into a writing groove, finding in it an activity that allowed her to create an intimate space, a space of the mind that she could inhabit or retreat into, almost like a refuge. More crucially, however, it enabled her to reconnect through recall with a life she had known and cherished, a life of political commitment, dedicated to a cause. The nourishment for her was intellectual, of course, but it was also emotional and psychological. For her circumstances, as hinted in her letter to her uncle, had undergone a sea change. By the mid-50s, the electricity that had sparked between Nayantara and Gautam had lost its powerful charge, and suppressed strains in the marriage were beginning to surface. Nayantara felt confined and dissatisfied in her role as corporate wife, had few close friends in Bombay, and missed the deep and direct engagement with the country's political life that had been bread and butter for all her growing years. Gautam, meanwhile, young, dynamic, and upwardly mobile in the world of business and profit, sensed neither his wife's loneliness nor her discontent, nor, crucially, her growing apart from him, perhaps because his own intense involvement with her never flagged. Nayantara acknowledged in a letter that, quote, I always felt he gave me much more than I gave him. He surrounded me with a storm of feeling, a never-ending passion, along with tenderness. He repeatedly told me and made me feel, and I did feel, that I was his whole world. No one could be sweeter or more considerate than Gautam. No one could be more ruthless either. He could not bear the thought that I did not belong to him wholly. There was an integrity about our physical relationship, a wholeness and reality about it. but he wanted nothing more than that I be wholly his. Restless and dissatisfied, Nayantara began to feel she couldn't continue with her marriage. There's a great deal more of detail in this, but of course I cannot go into that here. As always, when beset by doubt and confusion, she turned to her uncle for advice. Nehru suggested that she and Gautam go to Nagpur, where he was attending the January 1959 All India Congress Committee session, and discuss the problem in as open and accommodating way as possible. In Nagpur, he met them separately, spoke to Gautam about his own troubled marriage with Kamala Nehru, and how he had found it necessary to accommodate his personal and his political demands, the personal and political demands on him. To Nayantara he said, "Whatever you decide, I have your support. But don't be like Indu, neither married nor divorced." "We are not afraid of divorce," he said, "but remember, there are the children." In Nagpur, he also suggested that Tara spend some time with him in Delhi and then go to her mother in London in order to think things over. She did. She went, spent a great deal of time with her mother, returned to Bombay, determined to get a divorce from Gautam. 10 years, she said, 10 years, 49 to 59. 10 years was perhaps the limit of what the mind could take in this respect, because that was when the explosion came. Even during this period, I sometimes tried to tell Gautam how dissatisfied I was with our relationship, how I felt I was carrying a burden alone, not only of our marriage, but of our children, of everything big and small that had to do with her household. We were not building anything together. There was no meeting of our minds. Afraid and increasingly vulnerable in the face of Gautam's violent mood swings and a great deal of physical violence as well, Nayantara decided to act on Nehru's suggestion. As I said, she visited her mother and decided she was going to separate. In several letters to Gautam from London, she sought some kind of response from him to her genuine misgivings, some acknowledgement or reassurance that he understood her unhappiness. He evaded the issue, and she returned to Bombay, determined now to make her marriage work. This contradiction is something that recurs in her life, but I will go into it slightly later. Not a ripple disturbs the smooth surface of frontier history written after Nayantara's return from London and dedicated to Gautam. The month she spent in Delhi is mentioned only towards the very end of the book and only obliquely, with a telling reference to a conversation with her uncle Nehru, when she asked him, what quality did he consider most important for a successful marriage? He replied, "It is important always to leave the way open to talk. As long as two people can talk, there is a way back to understanding." When she came back from London, Gautam was unexpectedly gentle and considerate, promising to give her the space she required for herself, to doubt her less, trust her more, and so on. "I longed to have a proper conversation with somebody," she said, "just someone to talk to, but couldn't. Didn't dare," is how she put it, and her life was lived on two different planes. The conventional one of domesticity in her role as mother and wife of a successful corporate husband, within the well-defined norms of acceptable behavior, and an inner world of feeling, thinking, and growing discontent, which remained a closely guarded secret. "From fear set free, never said a word about anything that was really happening in my life," she said to me. "Nothing about the difficulties, emotional and otherwise, that I was up against at the time." Sahgal's admission tries to call with Wood's assertion about truthful autobiographies, reinforcing the point that for many women, although it may be possible to reveal the private in their autobiographical writing, their secret might well continue to remain concealed. The Nehrus and Pandits were not simply a family of rebels against empire, but a family of rebels against empire who also wrote, and in a subtle way, wrote back. There was no such thing as an Indian point of view, Nayantara has said. We were always being interpreted by others. As people under occupation, one of the main ways you were suppressed is that you were not allowed to express yourself politically. Even the fiction and non-fiction written at the time was through the lens of the Raj. It became a way for me to have my say about what really happened. A political way of writing for me was a very fundamental thing, because one had been denied freedom of speech. There was very real censorship then, to have one's mouth shut. To write politically was the only way for me to proceed. Nayantara's foray into writing then was not so much an exercise in self-expression or a young woman's dabbling in the realm of the literary. Rather, it was the medium she chose in order to fulfill a clear purpose, communicating an idea of India in an idiom inflected with an Indian accent, presenting a perspective that was a counter to prevailing and received wisdom, presenting, moreover, an account of an alternative politics. And yet her two memoirs cannot be read in the same register. Where Prison and Chocolate Cake is wholeheartedly about the tumult and exhilaration of political action and an intense personal commitment to it, From Here Set Free is about concealment, with the tension of uncertainty replaced by the mundane details of daily, or what Nayantara called, normal life. It was written in 1959, after she had made a conscious decision to bury her past so that her marriage could continue peacefully. The writing became a polite exercise, reflecting nothing of what was going on. It became part of her attempt to bring the curtain down on everything that had happened earlier. Superficially, it was a continuation of her life as it had ended in prison. But of course, it was a very different life. Before marriage and after marriage, a woman's life changes, she said to me, by way of explanation. A woman's life is very different from a man's. Although this provides a clue to the differing tone and tempo of Prison and From Here Set Free, I believe it tells only part of the story. In Prison and Chocolate Cake, the author's personal and political selves are a harmonious whole. There is no disjunction between the life she and her family led and the politics they believed in and practiced, and in her recounting of it. Although she might later have described it as naive and wondered how it could have come out sounding like this, i.e. upbeat, when it was about emotional strain and tragedy, about financial pressure, the repeated hardships of jail sentences, and the uncertainty about how it would affect the family, she never doubted the integrity of the endeavor or of her own faith in it. From Here Set Free, on the other hand, sees a split in this personal political persona, where both personal and political are concealed. The former as a consciously, deliberately exercised choice, the latter because she was no longer connected to the historic and heroic in the same way. Although, as Nayantara said, the book was rehashed at Connaught's request, the fact remains when they declined publication, she did not amend her narrative in any way for Golan, who would have welcomed the political content. Sara Pandit had become Nayantara Sahgal. Although her family connections obviously exposed her to the political life of the country, her mother was a diplomat, she contested elections, became governor of Maharashtra while Nayantara lived in Bombay, and so on. Her own circumstances at the time militated against anything more than a superficial involvement in it. As her biographer, I had obviously begun by reading all of Nayantara's published work, a substantial over 5 decades, covering almost every genre, including her political columns, written between 1967 and 1975. At the same time, I had also begun a series of long interviews with her, read files of correspondence, especially several thousand letters written to Ian Mangasrai during the most difficult time in her marriage, and spoken to her children and other members of her family. As I continued in my research, it became increasingly clear that I would have to read her autobiographies differently, read them as a kind of sentimental. I would need to read them as personal political, obviously, and possibly also as intended by her. But for any closer understanding of them, I needed to acknowledge not only the public and private, but perhaps also the private and secret. Yet this rereading would not have been possible without the supplementary material and resources that were made available, or if, like any lay reader, I had only her two published texts as my source. Nor would it have been as rewarding without the questing feminist interrogation of that defining fact of many writing women's lives, marriage and domesticity. Carolyn Heilbrunn has claimed boldly that for women writers, marriage represents a kind of closure, the end of the romantic road, and of the possibility of anything other than a domestic routine. She quotes Mary Mitford, who, when asked if she would not have liked to have been married, said, "No, I never wanted a full normal life." Most marriages, especially first marriages, continues Heilbrunn, are bad bargains for women writers. All good marriages are remarriages. Only those who remarry, she says, are married, echoing Stanley Cavell's conviction that it is in remarriage that we must look for its conversation, for its qualities of friendship, above all for its equality and the equality of the man and the woman's quest. All our earlier qualifications regarding autobiographies apart, it would be unrealistic to expect such writing by a woman in her late 20s and early 30s to be a complete or even substantial account for her life. Nor really was I preoccupied with whether or how much Nayantara reveals or conceals in her two texts, of how true she is to her experiences, how authentic is her representation, or how reliable her record. The self is seldom represented as unvarying, stable, and consistent over time. Representations of it will change as the autobiographer or memoirist's contingent reality and circumstances change, indeed as her life is lived. I see no serious contradiction between the self that Nayantara foregrounded in her autobiographies and what she revealed to me in her interviews close to 50 years later. Concealment, or what is also called self-censorship, is a spontaneous and understandable reflex when the issue is as intimate as marriage or when relationships are being renegotiated. It took Nayantara more than 30 years after her divorce in 1967 to publish a selection of letters between her and Mangasrai, whom she later married, in which for the first time we get a glimpse of the strains and stresses in her marriage. To have made this public earlier might well have entailed permanent closure of a relationship she still cherished with Gautam. When the correspondence was eventually published in 1994, she said her decision to do so was impelled by the need to, quote, set the record straight. And when Gautam Sahgal read the letters, he said he would shoot Ian Mangasrai. "Don't you dare come back to Chandigarh," he said to him, "otherwise I'll put a bullet to your brain." However, I would like to suggest an alternative, supplementary reading of her autobiography without supplanting or discounting any of my observations made earlier. Nayantara Sahgal's married life and her writing life, importantly, but her married life began to fall apart when she tried to deviate from a male-designed social and gender script for women, and very specifically from her husband's script for her, and for them as a couple. Ostensibly, and certainly as far as Menon was concerned, she had everything a woman could want. A husband who idolized her, the comfort and security of his success, a future of assured privilege. What could be ailing her? But as we know, chiefly from her letters, by her mid-20s, she had begun to want to create another script for her life, perhaps even to create another self. In the 8 years that elapsed between prison and from here set free, she simultaneously found and suppressed an emerging self, an alter ego who held the promise of freedom, but who also threatened to rock the marital boat. The terrible poignancy of her decision in 1959 to reconcile herself to an arid marriage, to bring the curtain down, as she said, on everything that might provoke another violent outbreak of jealousy, signifies a deliberate and willed silencing. From here set free reads like a polite exercise because at a superficial level it is a monument to a buried self. As an autobiographical text, therefore, it could go no further. But we must read it as a testament to Nayantara's determination to continue writing, and through her writing, to create another possibility of female destiny, both for herself and for her female characters. It is in her fiction, in the novels she wrote after From Here Set Free, that we see a more composite self articulated. It is in them, written through what has been called a curtained autobiographical practice, that we see a less troubled reconciliation than what she had been able to achieve in her own life till then. Thank you very much, Ritu. Shall we open the discussion with some comments and questions, some additions to carry forward the complexity that has been laid towards the end in particular? It's very, very intriguing, I think.
Absolutely fantastic. That's just my first one. And